G'day ladies and gentlemen, ScottyD here from the Australia's Tabletop Wargaming Network, and welcome into another installment in our From Sprue Tabletop series. Alrighty ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the next installment in our From Sprue to Tabletop series, helping you to develop hobbying skills and getting started in painting your miniatures. Predominantly focused around Warhammer 40,000, but the techniques can be applied to any miniature wargaming of choice that you may have. Now, in this series, we're going to continue to be sharing some key pieces of information that you need to know, and we're going to be tackling a topic that a lot of people utilize in their videos, but might necessarily talk about why or how to get started with, and we're going to talk about airbrushing. And today is going to be the first part of a couple of videos that we're going to be talking about airbrushing in our Airbrushing 101 video. Now, in this video, we are going to be looking at how airbrushes work and what to avoid picking up and what you might want to be picking up and have readily available when you are working with an airbrush starting off. But before we jump in, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank each and every one of you who has been watching our content here on YouTube, liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel. Really appreciate it. And we are slowly itching towards reaching the view hours for reaching community monetization, which is absolutely phenomenal. Really appreciate all your support in this goal, and we should be able to get there this year. I am sure of it. Let's jump into talking about airbrushing and how to get an airbrush and utilizing it. So what we're going to be focusing on for today's video is what you should be looking at when you are looking to purchase your first airbrush, as well as the items that you'll need around it and some things that you can kind of leave off to the side for the moment. Now, this is something that I've always been slightly annoyed by because I've always seen airbrushes pushed a lot in content out there through people using them quite regularly in their videos. Don't get me wrong, airbrushes are great, but they're often pushed as an essential hobby tool, which I actually personally disagree that an airbrush is an essential hobby tool for the hobby. Sure, it has got its uses and it can be great, but when starting out, I've heard a lot of hobbyists ask the question of, do I need an airbrush? Which, to my answer, I always say you don't need one, but if you want to get one and want to learn how to use one, then go for it. And that's always been kind of my perspective and my answer. And so I'm coming at these couple of videos about airbrushing from that perspective of, you don't need to grab an airbrush if you don't want one. You don't need to use an airbrush for your miniature painting if you don't want to. It's a tool like a lot of other tools in our hobby that you can utilize to help your processes. And so if you want to, you learn to use it because it is a new tool and how it works to help your hobbying, 100% go for it. And so that's why today's video, we're going to be looking at what you should be getting when you're looking to pick up your first airbrush. And it's going to be focused on the gear that you need to get and what you should be considering when you are picking up an airbrush and the things around it, as well as what you should be avoiding in an airbrush as well, because there are some things that you will not want to have on your airbrush. So we're going to start off by looking at an airbrush itself. Now, we're going to have some footage on screen throughout this video as well, showing my airbrush and what I use and the way it kind of works as well. Now, in my hands, I've got my airbrush that I own, that I personally use for a lot of different things in my hobbying, but mainly it is used for undercoating and base coating. Primarily, I haven't really experimented too much with other airbrushing techniques right now, but that is something I'm looking to do in the future. Now, there are quite a few different parts to the airbrush that you need to really consider and that I consider essential when you are looking to purchase one of the many different types of airbrushes out there. Now, the first thing I'm going to say straight off the bat, for your first airbrush, do not buy an expensive one. Grab a cheap one off Amazon, maybe grab an airbrushing kit as well that does come with a compressor, but make sure the airbrush and the compressor has all the factors that we're going to be talking about in today's video. Now, for your airbrush, there's going to be a couple of things that you do want to consider. There's probably two things that we're going to talk about that are highly important, and there's going to be two things that are nice to have features that aren't as important, but can really help your hobbying quite a lot if you have them as well. Now, the first and likely the biggest important piece of the airbrush is the paint hopper, which is at the top of the airbrush that I own. Now, what the paint hopper does is that's where you put your paint into using your airbrush. Now, with the paint hopper being at the top, you want to ensure that it is at the top because it is referred to, when it is positioned at the top of an airbrush, referred to as a gravity-fed airbrush. Now, it works in such a way that it pulls paint in from the hopper using gravity down onto the airbrush needle and feeds it through and out of the nozzle when you are using the airbrush. and it's using gravity to do the work. Now, the other type of airbrush that you'll want to avoid actually purchasing that is quite common is the suction-fed airbrush. That's what I kind of call it, where the paint hopper is actually at the bottom of the airbrush and uses airflow and air suction to actually draw the paint up into the airbrush instead of letting gravity do the work. Now, I recommend avoiding this one personally at all costs. I've used one previously when the GW had the spray gun that they had, and that was a suction-fed airbrush, basically, and it was painful to use. You would not use all the paint in the canister that you put the paint into. Also, you had a lot of paint on the tubing left over afterwards. It was a lot messier to clean, whereas using the gravity-fed one, it's a lot easier to clean. It's also not going to have a lot of wasted paint in there, unlike the suction-fed one as well. So I'd recommend avoiding the suction-fed one and looking for a gravity-fed paint hopper with the airbrush that you are looking to purchase to start off with as well. Now, the second aspect that I would also say is quite crucial that you do not want to not have on your airbrush is a dual action trigger on your airbrush. Now, the way that a dual action trigger works on an airbrush is that by pushing down on the trigger, it releases the compressed air from the air compressor into the airbrush and out the front, being released just below the needle, so it's spraying that paint onto your miniatures. And by pulling back on the trigger, you're actually releasing the paint from the hopper down onto the needle. When you pull back on the trigger, it pulls the needle back, allowing that paint to flow through quite nicely when you are utilizing your airbrush. So through using this dual action trigger, it allows you to have a lot more control with the amount of air that is being released, in conjunction with another function we're going to talk about later, as well as the amount of paint that you're allowing to flow through the airbrush when you are painting your miniatures as well. You may only want a little bit of paint going through, or you may want to have a nice even flow when you are doing your base coats, for example. Now, what you want to avoid, however, is a single action trigger on your airbrush. Now, this will only allow one of the two elements we talked about with the dual action. It'll either allow for the air to come through from the compressor, or it'll allow the paint to flow through on the needle. The issue with both of these is that if you are only controlling the air, you don't actually control the amount of paint that is flowing through the airbrush when you are utilizing it. And if you are controlling the paint flow, you're not necessarily controlling the airflow going through, and which can mean that if you've got remnants right at the front of the needle, it can actually splutter out onto the models once you've finished actually allowing the even paint flow to go through on your airbrush as well. So I would say that that is probably the two most crucial elements to have on your airbrush, is the gravity-fed paint hopper at the top of the airbrush and the dual action trigger. The next two elements are nice to have features because some of the airbrushes out there won't have maybe one or both of these features, but they're very nice to have, particularly when you're learning how to airbrush as well. Now, the first is a pressure valve. It's typically positioned at the front of the airbrush, kind of directly underneath where the paint hopper is, but just a little bit forward of that. And what this actually does is it actually controls the amount of compressed air that flows through your airbrush when you push down on that trigger to allow the air to flow through. And much like any other valve, the more you close it, the less air goes through, so that when you are spraying onto your models, you're not spraying with as much air, so not as much paint's being thrown, or it's not being as heavy on the coat as well. And the more open it is, the more air that is allowed through your airbrush when you are spraying the paint through your airbrush. Now, not having this feature on your airbrush isn't a big deal. However, you can still get the same effect, but you'll need to be aware of this, is how much PSI your compressor is actually set to, along with how easily the paints flow through your airbrush, because over time you may face clogs in your airbrush when you are painting. So you want to make sure that you're able to clear those clogs quite nicely through the use of air, and then you're cleaning it by using water through it at times as well, maybe some flow improver and a few other things we'll talk about a bit later on as well. Now, the second feature of an airbrush, which is nice to have, but not necessarily as important as the other three that I'm talking about, is a trigger restrictor. Now, this works basically as it sounds, is that it's generally at the back of an airbrush, and it's a little screw. And so the way it works very similar to the pressure valve. So you can screw it towards the trigger, which allows less range of motion to be pulled back on that trigger, which can restrict the amount of paint flow through the airbrush. And the more open it is, it allows for a lot more control with your trigger and a lot more paint to flow through on your airbrush as well. Now, where the benefit is of having this as a newer person to airbrushing is that you can set it to a level where you know there's a nice paint flow coming through without it absolutely saturating your models. So you can set that trigger restrictor to the point that you want it at, and so you can always just pull it back, hit that trigger restrictor, and you've got a nice even flow the entire time you're airbrushing without having to constantly get your trigger in the right spot for that flow throughout your process. And over time, you will actually learn not to need that trigger restrictor as you learn and get used to how much paint you actually want to be flowing through the airbrush over time. Now, without this feature, you'll just need to get used to controlling your airbrush trigger yourself without having the restrictor in place to be able to help you out learning that as well. Now, the airbrush is probably only one of two main components you'll need when using one, and the second one we've kind of already mentioned in passing, but that is your air compressor. Now, as you can see here, the air compressor that I personally have is the one you're typically going to want to have when you are purchasing an airbrush. Now, there's a couple of different elements that make it the go-to as to why you want this style of air compressor, which will allow for a smooth, consistent airflow through your airbrush. The first is the air tank, which on mine is below the compressor. It's generally a black cylinder at the bottom underneath the compressor that stores the compressed air. Now, what this allows the compressor to do is storing that compressed air in there at a certain air pressure level, so that when you are using your airbrush, once it hits a certain level, it'll stop the air compressor going, running. And so by having that air stored, you're able to use that stabilized compressed air through your airbrush without the compressor constantly running. And so you're able to have a consistent flow of air throughout your airbrushing session. And then once it hits a certain level of air pressure inside the tank, the compressor will turn itself on and start running to fill the tank with more compressed air as well. Now, the reason you want the air tank, this is probably the most crucial element of the air compressor, is that the compressor won't be running the entire time, because if you've got that air tank, it has the air pressure stored at a consistent level for your airbrushing. Whereas if you have the compressor running the entire time when you're using it, you are not going to have a consistent air pressure level when you are utilizing your airbrush. The next most important piece on the air compressor you want to have is the moisture trap. Now, you can get extra moisture traps that maybe connect at the bottom of your airbrush before they go to the hose to the air compressor, but mine has got one that is where the cable that goes from my air compressor to my brush, I actually connect the cable into the moisture trap on the air compressor instead, so it's at that side, so then it doesn't take moisture through into my airbrush, even through the cable. Now, basically, the moisture trap does exactly as it sounds. It traps any residual moisture from the compressed air as it's being stored in that air tank over time, and allows it to be nice and dry when you are using it with your airbrush, so it doesn't add any additional moisture to your paints. Now, without having this in place, initially, it'll just impact the consistency of your paint when it's flowing through the airbrush. When it combines with that air, it might be a little bit more liquidy. There's a few different ways that you could find your paint consistency impacted by this, and we'll look at that in the next couple of videos as well. However, over time, it will slowly actually damage the internal components of the hose if you don't have it at the front, as well as the airbrush itself, which you want to avoid at all costs, especially if you're using a more expensive airbrush that you'll get to. Of course, when you're first starting out, it's not as big an issue. Maybe you only paid $50, $100 for the entire kit, or maybe you're just getting a replacement airbrush. If you're the one you got in the kit, maybe it's $50 to get a brand new one. That's fine. But you want to avoid that if you're paying $150, $200, $300 for an airbrush, which some of the top of the line ones do cost that much, but they're a lot better when you are wanting to use more airbrushing techniques. But when you're starting out, generally you're undercoating and base coating, so a cheaper airbrush is perfectly fine for that. So with the main two components covered, you might be wondering what else you'll need for your airbrush before you get started. Now, there's a ton of additional accessories out there that you can get for your airbrush. However, there are only a few that I'd recommend you have on hand when you're starting off with. The first is cleaning brushes. Now, if you get an air compressor kit with an airbrush in there, they will generally have cleaning brushes in there. Now, these normally come on a small metal ring, and they have 5 different size brushes on them that you'll need when you are cleaning your airbrush. Now, when you do go to clean your airbrush, we'll talk about this in a future video, it is always important to clean your airbrush after every session, or after, if you're doing a day-long session, clean it at the end of the day. Now, these brushes are used to clean the different parts of your airbrush when you do disassemble it, from the nozzle to the paint hopper and everything in between. So you want to ensure that your airbrush is clean through using these brushes at the end of every airbrushing session. The next is paint pipettes. Now, these can come in a lot of different sizes in terms of how much paint they draw into them, as well as length as well. But you'll initially want to be using some to put paint in the paint hopper of your airbrush, particularly if you're not using airbrush paints that aren't in dropper bottles, such as the Citadel Air paint. You'll definitely want to use them for the Citadel Airs. However, if you are using dropper bottle airbrush paints, the paint pipettes aren't necessarily as required. Now, outside of those two items, there's a few things that you'll likely want to have on hand as well, and these are just general household items that you can probably get throughout your everyday life, which is perfectly fine. If you've got an old toothbrush lying around, you will probably want to hang on to that and use that for cleaning your airbrush, particularly in your paint hopper, as it will assist with cleaning a lot of the larger dried paint in your paint hopper over time, and scrub the outside of your airbrush if you need to as well. Some empty jars or containers that you can use for, water. You can also use one to just, what I say is evacuating the airbrush, or just flowing water through it to make sure it comes through nice and clean. So if you're doing different colors, you can make sure that, say you're using black first, that your blue that you're going to put through it next isn't tinted by the black that is still residual on the airbrush itself without fully cleaning it. So you want that. I generally work with 3. I work with one for clean warm water to put through the airbrush to clean it. I work with another one that I evacuate after using one color on my airbrush. I'll actually clean it through with that warm water into that tub. And then the third one I'll actually use for warm soapy water for when I'm actually looking to soak my airbrush to clean it. Next up, your typical having some paper towel on hand is really, really solid. A painting sheet or a painting cloth that you're able to put down so that you're able to protect the surface that you're airbrushing on if you're not using a spray booth, which is the next one. If you are using a spray booth, it's not as needed for the paint sheet or paint cloth, but it's also recommended, like if you're doing it across a desk or, such inside, that you're wanting to control where the overspray goes on your miniatures. That's another big one. And then the last one is gloves. Like, particularly if you're looking to hold your models while you're airbrushing, even if they're on like paint pots or timber stands or whatever you would have them on when you are airbrushing, it's always good to have gloves on so that you're able to not get paint on your hands, because whilst it is water-based acrylic, it can take a little bit to scrub off once it's dry. So you want to try and avoid that as best as possible. Just traditional cleaning gloves are fine, but if you do want to get like painter-specific ones, they are out there as well. But with those items kind of covered, that kind of covers it for all the core items that you'll need to get starting when you are looking to pick up your first airbrush. And over our next couple of videos, we're going to look at what you should be doing before you ever use your airbrush for the first time, as well as how to use the airbrush in practice when painting your miniatures as well. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, well, I hope that you did enjoy this informative video talking about airbrushing in our first part of our Airbrushing 101 series of videos here for our From Sprue to Tabletop series. Airbrushing is something that I've been quite interested in for a long time, and I've used it for quite a number of years now, probably about 8+ years when it comes to undercoating and base coating models. So I'm really excited to show the ability that this does have in conjunction with what you're able to do with various other products that are out there as well, such as inks. So we'll do some stuff in the future with those as well and show you some fun stuff. But if you are enjoying the content and you did enjoy this video, make sure to hit it with a like. If you have any questions around airbrushing or any items, or if you want feedback on a potential kit you're looking to pick up, feel free to let us know down in the comment section below. And if you haven't already, feel free to hit that subscribe button, turn on that notification bell so you'll be notified as to when we are releasing more content here on the network, from more videos in this series or our Wargaming highlights, how to play Warhammer 40,000 10th edition, and everything in between, ladies and gentlemen. Also, if you have any questions and you don't want to ask them here, that's perfectly fine. Feel free to come and find us over on Twitch at ATWN, where you can ask them live, where I'm doing hobbying sessions most weeks throughout a month, as well as doing tournament previews and tournament coverage as well. And you can ask your questions there, whether it's about the game or hobbying and such as well, and we'll be able to answer them live for you as well. And I also want to give a massive shout out to all of our Twitch subscribers and Ko-Fi supporters. Your financial contributions really do assist us in being able to produce the content that we do and cover more tournaments across the Australian Warhammer 40k tournament scene. I really do appreciate it. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.